Alrighty, well, welcome to our first live event here inside of the Showrunner Podcasting Community. Really happy to have you all here with us, and very, very happy to have our special guest, Harry Duran, with us to share some expertise, to share some knowledge. Harry, a lot of you probably know him, probably listen to his show. For those of you who don't, Harry is the host of Podcast Junkies. He is the founder of FullCast, where he empowers thought leaders to amplify their authority through the power of podcasting. And he made, I don't remember if it was a post or if it was a comment, but he made a great comment in one of the discussions that we were having inside of the community, and it was about, marketing and how to get more out of your podcast episodes. And so he and I started, kind of talking about it and thought it would be good to expand that into a full presentation here. And so that's what we're going to do today, and we're very excited about it. So with that said, I want to welcome Harry Duran in, and we're essentially going to turn it over to him for the next 20 to 25, 30 minutes because he's got a presentation prepared for us that'll be really great to learn from. So welcome, Harry.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, John, for having me on. It's been a pleasure to knowing you guys all these years. So excited to see what's happening with this community, with what you're doing with the new platform. And like everyone else here, I'm learning a lot about what's working, what's not. I know Pat Flynn likes to call himself the crash test dummy as well, so I really take that to heart. So a lot of what you see here is stuff that I've tested out that we're using with Podcast Junkies, and then when we see stuff that works, we use it with our clients as well. So this is always a work in progress. I'm always taking away and adding new slides here. So love to hear your feedback. Once we're done, I'll have the slides available as online as well. So if you want to take notes, you can, but I'll make the slides available for anyone who wants them afterwards to take a look at and go deeper on them. So it's called How to Squeeze Every Last Drop Out of Your Marketing, Every Last Drop Marketing Drop Out of Your episode. That's a typo. So what you'll notice is that I tend to talk pretty fast, and it's because I'm a New Yorker. So if you want to think of it as the podcast on 1.5 or 2x speed, and I'm going to be dating myself a lot of these slides. So if you feel free to jump in the chat and if you understand the reference, then I'll be more than happy to have that throwback. This is the Maxell slide, in case you guys are wondering where this graphic came from. That's a Maxell tape. So here's what I believe. I believe everyone that's on this webinar and everyone that's going to watch this after the fact has a unique voice, and I feel that unique voice needs to be heard by everyone whose message your podcast is for. But here's the thing, I don't want you to wait 20 plus years to find yours like I did. See, ever since I was a young teenager watching movies like this, and again, feel free to call those out, my father's voice was the first one. He instilled in me the importance of going to college and learning about business. This is an actual shot, but he would pull us into the living room and he would play tapes like tapes and vinyl, like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And a lot of that really didn't sink in, and I didn't really get these messages until after the fact. And this is the campus of Harvard. This is not where I made it. I actually didn't graduate from college. I went to Syracuse for a while. We actually did a road trip to Harvard one day. That's a separate story, and that's going to be in a different webinar. But what happened is I got my first suit-wearing job. And I was in cubicle life, and once I had the suit, and I was like, well, obviously everybody knows that once you have a suit, then you've made it, and I was in my 9-to-5 job and going to work every single day. And I was convinced, I was like, this is it. This is the pinnacle. Now that I'm wearing my suit and I'm putting it on every day, that I've made it. And his voice was like, you realize that he was the second voice, my boss's voice. He said, you realize that after a couple of promotions in a couple of years, you get a 6-figure salary. He goes, your 6-figure salary now puts you in the top 10% of all income earners. So I was like, well, that's definitely a good thing. But there was this seed sprouting up in me about new ideas. And I guess maybe at that time you would call it the entrepreneurial itch. And I was always on the search for new opportunities. And so in 1999, many of you will remember that's the .com craze. It hit, and it hit strong. And it was basically a gold rush for everything .com related. Companies were naming themselves .com, incorporating as .com, and pets.com came and went, as a lot of you might remember. And I had a partner of mine future business partner, and he's actually my friend who I went to visit recently in Florida, but he started a .com for Latino culture. And I was so convinced that this was my shot at .com millions that I cashed out my 401k, and I cashed it out to zero. And it wouldn't be the first time either. So needless to say, I probably wouldn't be on this webinar if that had panned out the way I thought it would. And I ended up, licking my chops, and I had to find myself back into cubicle life. I didn't take any copiers out to pasture, as you see in this scene from one of my, to those of you keeping score in the chat of the movie references, I appreciate that. But yeah, it was just back in there in the grind, and I was like, okay, I guess that didn't work out. And I sort of like resigned myself to being back in corporate America. And then the next voice was my half brother. And if you recognize this skyline, he convinced me to move down to Atlanta, of all places. And he said, I have a construction company. And I said, would you like to come down and be the GM of my construction company? And I was GM. I'm like an IT consulting to be the GM of consulting. And I was like, yeah, sure. It seems like a natural. Yes, the warning sign should have been that we sealed the deal in a Hooters restaurant. And you know what they say about working with family? That didn't necessarily pan out the way I wanted it to. And so 2 years later, I was back on a plane with my tail between my legs, forced to go live with my parents at 34 years old. So I tell you that long story as a preference. I know I talked about squeezing every last drop out of your marketing here, and you're wondering why I went into this story, but I think it's really important because I want you to think about everyone that's on this call and who's going to watch it later and who's watching it now, like how much time you spend listening to other people's voices while ignoring your own. And it really resonated with me. And I said, I need to figure this out on my own. I need to stop trying to ride other people's coattails. And I need to figure out what it is that I want to do. And so I was into electronic music, and I created a mobile app called Know Your DJ in, I think it was about 2012, 2013 with a friend of mine. And I said, I want to market this app because I grew up DJing, vinyl, turntables, all that sort of stuff. And I created this because we would go to conferences, festivals, and I wouldn't know which DJ was playing. So I created this app. I scratched my own itch, and I said, I want to go to a conference to learn how to podcast. So I go to New Media Expo in 2014. And it was there that I quickly shifted gears, and I realized how hard it was going to be to interview all these world famous DJs. And I said, look at all these podcasters here. And I started taking blurry selfies with the likes of Scott Stratton and Amy Porterfield, Pat Flynn. And I was like, these people all tell a good story. And I was like, I'm really interested in their stories, and I want to know what it is that makes them tick. And so what I started to do is I created a podcast called Podcast Junkies. And as a result, this was in 2014, and this is me in 2015 in a conference. And what I would do is I would create T-shirts. And so I would take these T-shirts to the conferences and give them to guests. And we'll talk about this in a little bit about the importance of treating your guests like gold. But I realized all these podcasters had a story to tell. And I was really fascinated. And some of you who have been in podcasting for a while might recognize some of these folks here, some of the team from Libsyn, Liz Covart from Benjamin Franklin's world as well. And Jared Easley, founder of Podcast Movement, is in there as well. So, and what I would do is I would just start going to these conferences and making connections with these people and developing relationships that would end up lasting me a lifetime. And a funny thing happens when you go to these conferences, you get to hang out with the likes of Mark Maron and Alex Bloomberg, who's the founder of Gimlet. If you haven't heard the first season of Startup, it's really fascinating for anyone who's an entrepreneur. That first season is really eye-opening. And I realized, wow, podcasting is taking off. This is incredible. They even created a show called Alex Inc., which is based on Alex Bloomberg's first season of Startup. Unfortunately, the show wasn't that good. I don't know if any of you actually saw it. I was really disappointed because I was really excited that there was a TV show about podcasting. But, now they just mentioned my dad started a porno, has just been picked up as a TV show. Night Vale has been picked up by Lore has been picked up by Netflix. There's a lot of exciting stuff really happening in the podcast space. And then what I did is I found out all these folks had stories to tell, and I learned a lot about what it takes to produce a show. And now my company FullCast produces shows. These are just a handful of the clients that we've been working with, and I've been doing that since for the past 3 years now with my company FullCast. So I have this view about what it takes to create a successful podcast. And so I'll outline it for you here. And I want you to think about it holistically. So there's 3 moving parts, but at the center of each successful podcast is authority, because everyone who's podcasting, that's the objective. They want authority. And the way you achieve authority is through what I call the pedals of reach, relationships, and return. And so when we produce shows for clients, we think of it in 3 different pillars. And I want you to think about your podcast this way as well, because people think there's just one thing to do. You produce a show and then you market it. But really, there's 3 different ways and 3 different aspects of it. And the first is to deliver, and the second pillar is to connect, and then the third is to influence. When we talk about delivery, we talk about, you'll see a lot of alliteration here, so there's a lot of P's. So there's finding your position, where exactly you're going to market your show, and then creating your plan, like what your outline is going to be and how you're going to execute on that plan. When we talk about connect, it's about production and publishing. Production is the quality of your show and how you produce it, and making sure you're recording. And there's 500,000 podcasts in iTunes, and so there's a lot of competition out there. So you want to make sure you sound great from day one. And when you publish it, what are the major platforms you're going to be on? Obviously, iTunes gets about 60 to 70% of all listens. Spotify is now a close second. So, where are you going to be publishing your show? And then when we talk about influencing, it's really ramping up the promotion. So we talk about syndication, social media, and then profit is designing a profit model. And that could be anything from profiting through monetary gains, or profiting through more listeners, or profiting through sponsorships. There's a bunch of different ways to slice that. Now, there's repercussions if you don't get this right. So think of it as the opposing wedge of the pillar. So if you don't deliver, you're not going to have consistency. And if you don't connect, you're not going to have an audience. And if you don't influence, you're not going to have any clients and or listeners to the show. So we're going to dive deep into promotion, but I wanted you to see the whole picture, and we have enough time I really wanted to go deep rather than just touching on the surface of one of these. So we're going to talk specifically about ramping up promotion. So here's the problem. I want you to think about this. If you don't get this right, you're not going to connect with your audience. You're not going to have follow-up. You're going to lose opportunities, and as a result, you're going to drop the ball on your show. The flip side, the promise, if you do get this right, you're going to have a strong connection. You're going to have proper follow-up, you're going to engage throughout, and you're going to spread the word, which is really important for all podcasters here. So this idea of influencing the pillar, ramping up promotion, we're going to dive deep into this. There's 5 keys here I'm going to take you through. Now, the first one is this idea of getting real. And getting real is something that I alluded to in the beginning. We talked about this idea of, for me, I have a podcast about podcasting. So it gets super niche here and super meta. So for me, it's really important for me to be at podcasting conferences. And I want you to think about your shows. I know there's folks in here. I know I saw a mention about Dungeons and Dragons. I saw a mention about Eric Truls talking about his travel podcast. It's really important for you to be in the space where you're going to find listeners. And it may have nothing to do with podcasting. I just so happen to have a podcast about podcasts, so I want to be at podcasting conferences. But if you have a travel-based show, you probably want to go to travel meetups. If you have a Dungeons and Dragons-based show, you want to be in forums, at conferences where people are talking about that. And ideally, if you're the only one with a podcast about that, that's even better because you're going to stand out. So this is really where I find my connections. This is really where I find my audience. And this is where I deepen the relationship with the people who are on my show. You'll notice in the back, behind Kate Erickson is in front of the gentleman with the cowboy hat. And Kate is the partner of John Lee Dumas. She helps with Entrepreneur on Fire. And so behind her, there's a bag of T-shirts. And so essentially, I order T-shirts, and it's an investment for me. These are not cheap. The cheapest I think I've gotten is like $5 each. But for me, I think I'm and not everybody can do this, but for this idea of building relationships, building awareness, I can't tell you how many people have told me, I used to see you as the guy walking around with these bright yellow shirts. I didn't know who you were, but I was like, who is this guy walking around? Why is everybody wearing these yellow shirts? And how do I get my hands on one of them? Because it's really like marketing, just a marketing genius, because it's one of the most biggest contrasting colors, by the way, which I didn't really think about when I created the artwork, but that's why you see a lot of road signs on black on yellow. So it's just, again, ideas for you to think about where you can physically be to market your show. A lot of people want to do this behind a screen, and they think magically all the marketing is going to happen by pushing a lot of buttons on a computer. And you got to get out there and pound the flesh, like they say, kiss some babies and shake a lot of hands and give a lot of hugs. And for me, that's the podcasts are really important for me for that. I went to a New Media Expo. I talked about this was in 2015, and they had a booth set up where they were allowing recordings. And so Jared Easley was there, and we started talking. I had realized I wanted to have him on the show. So again, when you go to these conferences, you just look for opportunities to record and capture content. And so that's what I did here interesting fun fact about this is that Jared is an old school hip hop head, so he beatboxed. He beatboxed the opening of this. So if you listen to this episode, I'll get the episode number for you later. But he would beatbox it, and I freestyle rapped it. It's probably the worst freestyle rap beatboxing combination in the world, but it was a fun thing to do. And I didn't think much about this. We just had a little bit of fun. So it's the intro to this episode with Jared Easley. And what happened is, couple years go by. I'm at Podcast Movement this year, getting ready to speak. I did a podcast primer for newbies in the beginning of the day before Podcast Movement. And as I'm getting ready for this and getting ready to show up at Podcast Movement, Jared reaches out. He's like, "Hey, Harry, we want to do something different. We normally announced the episode intros. And the announcements, the announcements for the conference." And he said, "Would you be willing to freestyle rap the announcements?" And I was like, okay. So based on what we had done here, just having a little bit of fun, and me, marketing some different aspects of, not taking yourself too seriously with your episodes, he remembered that. And so fast forward to Podcast Movement a couple of weeks ago in Philly, I was on stage and they would read the announcement. We did a little bit of rehearsal, and obviously I wrote some of these beforehand. Chris was there, I think he remembers, and I freestyle rapped the announcements. And it was a lot of fun. The only thing that I didn't do is I fully have my my hoodie down so they could see my Podcast Junkies t-shirt. But again, talk about marketing your show. I mean, I was introduced as the host of Podcast Junkies because of something fun I did. So just, you never know when people are going to see something after the fact and get ideas for how you can come back. If you show expertise in a specific area, they may have a conference coming up, or some of these podcasters. And at the time, Jared was just getting started with the Podcast Movement, and now, it's a 2,000 person event. It's crazy. I remember when it was an actual Kickstarter in Dallas. So it's this idea of planting seeds and telling people like what it is that you do about your show. And so if they're part of a platform that's going to grow bigger, they're going to think of you. So find out places where you can add value, places where people are doing local meetups. You never know when some of those, people that are doing local meetups, they may end up doing a bigger conference, and they'll remember that you were there to support them at their local thing. So when it gets bigger, they'll think about different ways to incorporate that and involve you. Number 2, I like to refer to as the golden rule. And for those of you that may or may not know, the golden rule is to treat other people like you want to be treated. And I really have this mantra of treating my guests like gold. And so as an example, when I book clients on a show, we use a tool called Calendly. And so when we book, this is the information that I ask for. And it's pretty basic information. I think a lot of people listening will do the same. I ask for the first name, last name, email address. At the time I was asking for Skype ID. Now we're using a different tool called Squadcast. So we're going to update that. I asked them for a high resolution headshot, and I ask them for their primary website and social media handles. And then I ask them if they have a service or a product they want me to mention. Now, why is this important? The high resolution headshot is, I learned early on that if I'm going to make my guests look good, slapping together an image I found, some blurry pixelated photo that I just happened to scrape off Twitter, is not going to be good, because it's going to make them look like crap, and then it doesn't really seem like I took an interest in making them shine. So I learned early on, I would just be chasing down guests for these headshots. And a lot of times, podcasters now are taking their visibility seriously. And I think a lot of folks have gotten headshots. I know that there's services now where people can go to these conferences and get headshots done pretty cheaply. So there's no reason as a podcaster you shouldn't have at least 1 or 2 available, so that when you're on a podcast, remember you're marketing yourself as well as marketing your show. Take the lead. I'm asking for it naturally, but if people aren't doing this when they're booking time and you're appearing on someone else's show, then offer that up. Make sure you offer a high quality headshot so you're in control of your image and how you're being presented. Because what you don't realize is that some podcasters are going all out and creating a lot of artwork based on that image. And that's what we do for clients. And so the website and social media handles are important, because when I promote a guest, I want to be able to tag their handle. And a lot of times they use names that may not be their first and last name on social media. So I want to know ahead of time, what's your social media handle, so I can tag you appropriately. And so we do that for our clients now, and I do that for guests on Podcast Junkies. And then asking them if they have a product or service is really important, because as we have the conversation, if they happen to mention a book or they happen to mention a new service that is about to launch, the reason I like that is because I, as the host, control the ability to make that introduction in a way that's, casual. So if John tells me he's got his book coming out, and I was like, hey, John, Johnny, tell me about the book. I know you just finished it. I know you worked hard on it. Tell me a little bit why that's near and dear to your heart. That just sounds so much more natural than waiting for John to wait for a moment where you can just jump in and plug his stuff. So that's one of the reasons I do that. So I recommend you do that as well. And again, it's this idea of making your guests look good. And that's why I call it the golden rule. I want them to be treated like I would like to be treated if I was a guest on another show. We talked about the artwork. Jordan Harbinger was recently on for a second trip on Podcast Junkies. He had a fantastic interview called, which we titled "What You Need to Know to Crush Your Next Interview." We use the image that he's provided us. We use it on our Instagram pages. And so there's two versions we create, which is the square image. And we'll put that in our ID3 tags. We host a Libsyn, so that's why we put it in there. But we show it on Instagram. Occasionally we have it on SoundCloud too, but anywhere else we can use a square image. And then we create a banner image. And this is just the standard 1280 by 720 is the measurements for anything you want to appear on YouTube. So this is the one we create. And you can use this on Twitter and on Facebook and on the show notes page. And I'll show you how we do that on our show notes page. But this is just a great way to get really, I think of this almost like a banner, as if it was like a billboard. Like you're going down the road and you see like, oh, this is great. It's got the title and I know exactly what they're going to be talking about. And it highlights the guest. When guests see this artwork, it really puts a smile on their face. Everyone likes to see their name in lights, and they see that you're going above and beyond to make sure that they look good on social media. So this is why that's really important. So I'm going to outline what we do. Once a guest is on the show and they've had their interview, I'm going to send that guest the following email. So I'll outline the different components. And it's going to say, hey, Jordan. So this is in the case of Jordan Harbinger. I'm going to customize the hello. Just means, hey, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate you coming on the second time around. I think the audience got a lot more value of the fact that you were really willing to share your story of how you left the Art of Charm and now you started the Jordan Harbinger show. And I appreciate you being vulnerable. So just kind of something that personalizes and lets them actually understand why it is that you appreciate they were on the show. And so then I start producing links that he can click on. And these are all, I want to make it drop dead easy for Jordan to share this because I don't want him to feel like he has to work harder to market my show. I'm the one who's supposed to be doing the heavy lifting and I just can kind of like give him the easy layup. So we use pretty links a lot. So you can use podcastjunkies.com/iTunes. It'll take you straight to iTunes, which we should probably be calling Apple Podcasts at this point, or else Apple's going to get upset. So I'll probably need to update that, make sure it says Apple Podcasts. You can view it on the show notes page. So I let him know that we've created a show notes page specifically for his episode. I said, or you can engage on our social media posts. So if he's active on any one of these platforms, it's going to naturally encourage him to go on that platform. And I give him the links to our social media pages on Instagram, on Facebook. And I said, we have a behind the scenes Facebook group, which I creatively called Podcast Junkies. And so that's where we share. It's a recommended thing, and I'll talk about that in a second as well, to have a Facebook group for your own show. And then I said, I've included a ready-made tweet. You can feel free to modify it in your own voice. And I give him the language there. So all he has to do, and we create this with a service called Click to Tweet, it creates a clickable tweet. So he would literally click on this and it would open up in Twitter. And he would just review it and he could just send it along. And I said, or if you prefer Facebook, you can start with this. And I type out a couple of words for a phrase that he can use if he wants to in Facebook or in LinkedIn. And then lastly, I said, if you're looking to additional ideas to spread the word, past guests have shared their episodes in the PS of their weekly newsletters. And you'd be wondering why I might include this. I found out early on, I interviewed someone by the name of Jason Stapleton, and he has a podcast called The Jason Stapleton Show. And it's a daily show. He's a libertarian, so he's got a huge following. And what I didn't know is he also had a huge email list, and he promoted the episode in his email list. And to this day, it's one of the most downloaded episodes ever in Podcast Junkies because he just had that wide reach. And so, you never know when you're going to be interviewing someone who's just got a big following and a huge email list. And so definitely what you want to do is remind them and say, hey, even if their podcast, people like to tell you where they've been. So if I was just on Jared's show, I'd be like, oh, hey guys, I was just on Jared's show as well. I could be talking about whatever. I could be talking about my stuff, about my business. But the fact that I was interviewed on someone else's show it's a nice thing to include, and you don't have to make a big deal about it, but sometimes just something as simple as a PS. So again, you're just making it easy and giving your guests reminders about the different ways they can promote the episode. And then I call this reminisce. It's just, again, another way that I like to have fun. I don't like the idea of having thinking of a guest coming on a show as a transaction. I think of it more as a relationship. And so I don't like this idea where this idea of chasing influencers, of getting people on your show to say, hey, who's the biggest name that I can come on so I can use them for their visibility, and then I'm gonna like thank you for coming on, and then done with you and on to the next one, chase the next influencer. And so for the longest time, I've just looked for different ways to promote the things that my past guests are doing, and also to bring up past episodes. So I did something a little fun. Again, you can use a tool like canva.com, and Pixlr is a great graphic design tool. It's online. Something to keep in mind when you create these graphics, remember that if you're going to embed them into your ID3 tags in Libsyn, they've got to be below 500 kilobytes. And a lot of people lose sight of that fact when they're creating this really nice cover art. So Pixlr is my just go-to tool. It's online, it's cloud-based. I just go in there, resave it, and just make sure the size of it is less than 500K. So this was just a simple template I created in Canva, and now we try to do this every Thursday. We do Throwback Thursday and just make it like a little old-time newsy feel, and I was just bring back into circulation the past episodes. I got a lot to catch up on because I'm at episode 177, so I think we're going to start releasing 2 or 3 of these a day. So again, if a guest has been on your show, look for different ways that you can continue to engage. I've had guests who have got books coming out, and I've promoted on Twitter and on LinkedIn, or they're going to make an appearance on another show. That's a big deal for them. So I think I just had Mignon Fogarty was talking to another guest, Erica Mandy. So I had 2 previous Podcast Junkies guests, and I just kind of forwarded that as well. So another guest, Ben Adair, has started a new production company called Western Sound, and he had a post for a new editor they were looking for. Just all these different opportunities. I can't keep track of everyone, but it's just fun ways to engage with the community and continue to add value for your guests. When we talk about celebrate, this was episode 165. So it was literally everyone that had been on the show up until that point. This was on Canva. I did this in Canva. It took me a long time. You can look, I think John and Jared should be able to find their their photo there. And there's some folks on there. But basically, I went out of my way. I was like, who's on there from episode 1 to episode, at this time it was 165. It was my 4-year anniversary. And I was just so excited, and a lot of times we don't stop to celebrate the wins, and I recommend you as a podcaster, whether it's you hit episode 50, you hit episode 100, you hit the 1-year mark, you hit the 4-year mark, whatever it is, like find little ways to celebrate. And then, just say, hey, past guests, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, because mine's an interview-based show, and I had to do something to recognize that. And sometimes we're so preoccupied with getting to the next download and producing the next episode that we're just like, wait, 4 years went by and I didn't even say anything about that. And I was like, man, this is not right. So I'm going to make sure when I hit 5 years or when I hit 200 episodes that I just stop and, stop and smell the roses, if you will. And it's a reminder to everyone who's got a show, when you hit those milestones, celebrate them, because you're going to inspire other people who are just getting started with their first couple of episodes. I was there, when I had episode 1 and I had episode 2 and episode 3, I was like, man, this is going to be a long time before I even think about it, episodes, 50 or episode 100. And now we're closing in on episode 200. So yeah, definitely celebrate the wins. And then what I did is I created 7 or 8 different tweets, because basically what I did is I tracked down everyone's social media handle. And so you can only do 240 characters in Twitter. So it took me a while. I think I had to cycle through like 7 or 8 of them before I was able to tag everybody. But I made it a point to at least once tag people, at least the guest, at least once on Twitter. And I put this image on there. Say, hey, thanks for getting me to this point. So little things you can do to continue to celebrate. Point number 3, take a drink of water, is this idea of opening the kimono. And some people like to call this how the sausage is made, but it's this idea of sharing the insides, the insights into what it takes to get your podcast made. And so I've got a couple of Facebook groups, and I've been interested to see what Jared and John are doing with the Mighty Networks channel as well. But I had created one specifically for my business called Podcasting for Thought Leaders. And then I created Podcast Junkies, which is basically the inside scoop of what's happening with Podcast Junkies. And it's just a fun place. You don't have to get too serious there. Every time there's an episode, naturally, I promote the episode there. I tag the guest. We create an audiogram. I place it in there as well. I started seeing Facebook was giving me birthday updates, and this is hard to keep up with. So I've got to find a better way to kind of. I've got a VA that helps me with this. But essentially, for a while, I was noticing people's birthdays on Facebook, and I had just a Canva template. And I would just pull in. Patrick is one of the super fans of the show, so I put this in the group, and he got a nice smile on his face and a couple of extra birthday wishes. So everyone's going to get the one line "Happy Birthday, Patrick" and Facebook that everyone sees when you're notified that. So to the extent that you can do something different, and if it's been a guest on your show, it definitely puts a smile on their face. I would do, Disco is the name of my Yorkie, and so we would do walks this is me in California. I'd just go out and it's like, okay, I haven't done a Facebook Live, and you can do a Facebook Live straight into the group. So that's something I tried. And then when I had behind the scenes stuff happen, I was at Podfest, and I was pulled in to give an interview for The Messengers 2. If you haven't seen The Messengers 1, it's a great documentary about podcasting. It was directed by Neil Gilarte, John Dennis, and Chris Krimitsos from Podfest had a big part in putting that stuff together. So it's a whole documentary about podcasting, which is fascinating. So I was pulled in for an interview with that, which I thought was pretty cool. So I shared that with the group as well. So pjnk.es/PJJ, that's the link to the Podcast Junkies group. And then just as a reminder, what Jared and John are doing with the Mighty Networks, it's been really interesting to watch as well, because I'm trying to decide and I'm having discussions with clients about how to create this community where people can focus on it. And one of the things I love about what you guys are doing here is the fact that it doesn't have the Facebook noise. So you can come here and not be distracted by all the other things that are happening, all the shiny objects with Facebook. So it's been really interesting to watch. I have the reminder up. I have the app installed on my phone as well. So I set the alerts. It's one of the few apps on my phone that I allow to give me notifications. And so it's been really interesting to see, because I know, Jared posted something that he was looking forward to today's chat. And I think I really like that it's really super focused in here. And I'm really excited with what's happening there. So I've been watching this pretty closely as well. So again, create a community for your listeners, because they're going to want it, because you think, why am I going to do this? And in the beginning, you're going to have 5 people or 10 people in there. But if it's for your specific show, you'll be surprised at the super fans that come in, and I'll always, there'll be the regular group of folks time and time again, but those become really your super fans, and you want to give them a platform. Number 4, one more movie reference in case you got, this one's pretty easy though. It's one of my favorites. Draw your marketing map. And so when we talk about marketing map, I talked about one of the things that's really important for me is to write detailed show notes. And thankfully I have a team that helps me with this now. But in the beginning, I was putting this together, and I think it's really, really helpful. So this was, of all people, William Hung. I found him, I ran into him at Podfest. I did not know he had a podcast. And this was actually one of the last seasons, I think, of American Idol that my wife and I watched. So when I saw him roaming the halls of a podcasting conference, I immediately piqued my interest. I had him on the show recently. And so a couple of things we do, and I know, Showrunners on a different platform, but this is just some ideas to this idea of callbacks. There's a plugin for WordPress that allow you to show the previous post and the future post. But even on your own show, one of the things I like to do is this idea of open loops and callbacks. So if you listen to Podcast Junkies, you'll notice that in the beginning I say, hey, if you're new to the show, and that's an important line. Like, you always want to be rolling out the welcome mat for guests. You never want to assume that people that are listening have been listening to your show week in and week out. And people may have just discovered it. I maybe have people that love American Idol and just listen to this one episode. So I want to say, hey, if you're new to the show, this is the show where I interview some of the most fascinating podcasters I can find out there. And I just have fascinating conversations to learn about things that make them tick. So again, very simple, roll out the welcome mat every single time. In case you missed last week's episode, I spoke to Denny Crahy. Denny's been an early guest, and now he's been a return guest, and he had his new book out, and he talks about the importance of putting in the daily work. And so, really quick, it's just it's just a call back to a previous episode, and it just plants that seed in the mind of the listener that you have other episodes. It's a nice way to market the past episodes. And then what I do in my outro is I do this idea of an open loop. And if you're familiar with TV shows and cliffhangers, this is very, very common. It's this idea of leave them wanting more. So I said, tune in next week. We're gonna have a great conversation with Rick Mulready. He talks about his life growing up, learning with a passion for ice skating, and how he moved that until he produces a business that's all about Facebook ads. So it's something that naturally leads into that. You never know when it may pique an interest, and they're like, oh wait, I know Rick already, and I didn't know you were going to interview him. So you can't assume that they're going to be following everything you do. So every little opportunity you get, you have them as a captive audience. They're listening to this specific episode. So do that open loop and do that callback. You always want to make sure you have a way to collect emails, and you can slow down the conversation. Keep in mind that 80% of podcasts are listened to on mobile devices. So people are on the treadmill, they're in traffic, they're making dinner, they're walking a dog. They don't have time for 10, 12 different things. At the end of your outro, say, hey, listen to me on Facebook. Follow us on Facebook, and don't forget to join me on Twitter and sign up for my email list. And then click this download. And then people are overwhelmed. And so you just want to have a simple call to action. And what I like to do is get them to a landing page that'll collect the email, and then you slow down the conversation. And so once you collect the emails, you can say, hey, by the way, did you know we have a Facebook group? By the way, did you know we're on social media? So keep it a simple call to action. Apple is making a big deal about having the proper buttons there. So that's kind of why I have multiple subscribe options. Remember, for some reason, they want you to be using now to listen on Apple Podcasts. Google Podcasts is big. So I really think you should have the Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. Like I said, Libsyn is now giving stats on listens, and Apple and Spotify now is about 6 or 7% of listens. I tested this out myself when I caught up with my dad a couple of months ago, and we were talking about podcasts, and he said, I'm listening to a podcast, which was the first thing that was surprising for me. It was about grounding. It's about basically when you have your bare feet on the grass and you're sort of connect with the earth. And that was the first surprise. I was like, I didn't realize you listen to shows like that. And the second one was, where did you hear a podcast? And he said, on Spotify. I was like, oh, that's interesting. A lot of people listening, older generation and new generations are interesting. The two bookends there are listening to music. And so it's just a natural segue for them to find podcasts. And they're doing a big deal for making people listen to there. So just a couple of other buttons I have on there. If you can, to the extent, have a way for them to play it on your site, there's a lot of embed play options on there. So just some ideas to think about when you think about show notes. And then we put timestamps in ours. So this is the second half of that page. And then just additional social media destinations. If you can, we put tweetables. There's a plugin for that available to allow people we pull 3 to 5 quotes out of every conversation. And you can create these manually, or you can use a tool for that. But it gives you more content to create on social media. A lot of people will realize that Twitter does not like you repeating the same content. So if you've got quotes, that gives you new text you can use. And we like to promote an episode every day. An episode is live for the 7 days of that week, because the Twitter stream is so fast that you could think you can promote it once on Twitter and it's going to do the trick. It's not. And then you can use audiograms, you can use the graphics we created, we can use the quotes. And so when you use a combination of all those, you get a lot of variety in your tweet, and you're not going to get the crackdown from Twitter because you're posting content that looks repetitive. This, I don't know if this will play. I'll put it back. But this is essentially the audiogram. We had this this was the PDF, so that's why you won't see it, but it's embedded. And it's essentially, it's an animated waveform. If you go to headliner.app, you can create these for use in social media. Again, this goes back to the banner image we use. You can pick the animated waveform, and then when we work with our editor, we have them pull out a 15 to 20 second audio snippet. So if you have someone who's editing a show, or if you're editing your show, as you're listening through it and editing it, listen out for something that's going to be noteworthy and something that will tease the conversation. We actually put these snippets at the beginning of our episodes. So when you listen to a Podcast Junkies episode, the first thing you hear is this audio snippet. And that's sort of a way for people to lean in and say, wow, this is interesting, or I can't wait to hear this when it's mentioned in the show, or maybe it's something that's out of context and it's something funny. You're like, I wonder why he said that particular thing. So now I'm leaning in a little bit more, and I'm excited about sort of you see this done on TV shows too. They're like, in case you missed it last week, they do the recap, but then they kind of give you an idea, a tease about what's going to happen. So we pull this in the Headliner app. It's a free app, so you can create these audiograms for free. I don't know how they're going to monetize it. I think there's other ways to do branding on there, but it's be interesting to watch. This was originally called Spearman. It came out of NPR. They were working with some NPR, and they made it as a free tool. Headliner is the one that actually took off and allows you to create these audiograms. So a couple things here. And so tracking, do you want to jump into questions, or do you want to save them to the end, Jared?
No, you have one more step, right?
Yeah, a couple more, yeah.
Yeah, no, let's keep going. The conversation in the chat is something, it's a side conversation about Spotify. Tracking Spotify?
Again, so for repurposing, syndicating content, we also post it on Medium. I like platforms where you can tag other people. So a lot of people are blogging on Medium. So to the extent that sometimes I have guests that also have a presence on Medium, I do an @, their name comes up and I tag them. So this is the recent episode with Craig Price on his show, Matinee Heroes. And again, it just gives me content, SEO friendly content. Google is searching these sites. Medium is a very, very popular site for long form content. So it gives me a way to promote specific episodes. So we do this every time an episode's live, we put it on Medium. And number 5, join the party. Who can resist a party with Richard Simmons? If you haven't heard, I think it's called Finding Richard Simmons, the podcast. It's fabulous. I was fascinated by it. I think it's one of those podcasts that I binged. I think it's only 6 episodes, 6 or 8 this episode. Apparently he dropped off the radar, and people were tracking him down trying to find out where he was. So it's this idea of leverage. I'm using right now Libsyn as an example because it's one of the sites we host with. But just I want you to see the list of all the options that are available, and then you can work with like whoever you're hosting with. But you want to make sure Alexa is really important to get your show on Alexa. If they have a specific app, here you can send it to Blogger, Facebook, Google Play Music, not so much because it should be on Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio. If you've got some people create an app specifically for their phone. Here, obviously, we talked about Spotify, Tumblr, TuneIn Radio, Twitter. Again, if you can leverage any of these tools to get on platforms that already exist, and if there's a way to get that content there automatically, all the better. I know a lot of people are putting content on Instagram, and then they're using the share option so it shows up on Twitter. This is a little hack on ifttt.com. And again, a great site for repurposing content. This is a specific recipe that will tweet your Instagrams, and it'll pull in the photo so that when it shows up on Twitter, you don't just get the URL entry to Instagram. It'll actually show the image. So if you're actually going to the work of creating artwork for Instagram, when you share it on Twitter, if you just do the auto share, you're just going to get a link and no one's going to see the graphic. So this is simple to set up. Again, this is a free tool, IFT, if this, then that. You can link to, you link the 2 accounts together, and it'll take your artwork and it'll push it to Twitter so that when it shows up in the feed, it'll say what you talked about in Instagram, and it'll show the graphic as well. The other thing we talked about, let's say Alexa, if you had Alexa and the Showrunner podcast was on there, one of the stats that I thought was really fascinating is how many people have access to a smartphone. And I also heard another metric. I think either Alexa specifically or these home speakers are the fastest devices to get to 50 million installs, faster than the iPhone, faster than mobile apps, faster in terms of adoption. It's an interesting platform to watch. And I think in the world that we're moving towards, the world of voice, looking into how you can also have your podcast as a skill on Alexa is really important. It's something we're starting to work with clients to get them onto Alexa. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting is this idea of Alexa briefings. And if you're not familiar with an Alexa briefing is a 1 to 2 minute snippet. It pulls in a podcast feed. And what I've seen some people do that's really interesting is that it create a feed, a Alexa briefing for their show, which gives it the highlights. So if you have a business podcast, you would give like a 1 or 2 minute snippet, and it's daily. So you would have a daily show. What happens is you go to the Alexa skills page on Amazon, you subscribe to the briefing, and then you say, Alexa, play my briefings, and it starts playing all the briefings you subscribe to. So I'm creating now one called the podcast briefing that's going to support my business. So something to look into. We're still in early stages, but I think there's going to be a lot of adoption. We're moving into this world of the always connected home, and people are coming into their homes and saying, turn on the lights, play my podcast, start the coffee maker. And the cars are going to have that too. So, and these devices are now being embedded into the actual speakers you already have in your home. So Bose, Harman Kardon, Sonos, they're already in discussions with Amazon and Google, and they're embedding these speaker devices actually into the speakers already. So it's something to look into in terms of getting your content found on other platforms. So a lot covered there. Recapping, make sure you get real. You show up in person at these events where you're going to have the most connection. The golden rule, treat other people, AKA your guests, like you want to be treated. Open the kimono, share the stories that are happening on behind the scenes of your podcast. People want to know the inside scoop. Draw your marketing map, have a plan for how you're going to do this, and try one thing at a time. Don't try to just shotgun blast all of these. Find one platform that works for you specifically and go deep on that. And then when you've got that honed in, then you add the other platforms. and join the party. Just try to syndicate your content on as many platforms as possible, and try to find, you never try to want to dictate where your listeners are, because a lot of people only live on Twitter, only live on Instagram, and if you try to force yourself and saying, I'm not only going to be on these specific platforms because it's not easy for me to post there, you may be missing out. And some people may be only on those platforms. So try to have a presence at least a little bit on these. And that's why you want to use some of these automated features. And then eventually you can go deeper, but try to have a presence on at least the major platforms. So again, I'm going to make the slides available at podcastjunkies.com/showrunner, hopefully within the next hour. So for people who are watching the replay, they'll get that right away. But I think, and I'm at Podcast Junkies on Instagram and podcast_junkies on Twitter. I think that's it.
Wow, that was great, Harry. So much great information, a lot to take in. Really appreciate you coming on and doing that. We have a little bit of time left for questions. Johnny, I know that you had one, so why don't you hop in and ask your question, and then those of you who are here, if you want to ask a question using the Q&A, that's probably the best place to post it, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But Johnny, why don't you go ahead and ask yours?
Thanks for doing this, Harry. That was pretty darn great. And I guess to me, marketing is about the metrics of it. Mm-hmm. I only want to continue doing any marketing channel if there's actually results coming from it. That's just how I am, not just about being everywhere. So with that said, I know you use a lot of automation tools for different ones, but I'm sure you track metrics to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. If or when any of us listening only have, say, time to really implement one or two, and I know that it's different for every audience, but like which one or two, like what 20% is giving you your 80% of results?
I mean, I think I would have to say a lot of activity happens on Twitter. And it's actually where I found listeners. Susie Buttress, who's part of the Showrunner group now, I introduced her to you guys, and I see that she's been pretty active. This was literally a tweet. Someone was sharing, hey, listening to these episodes, my favorite podcast right now, and it was, one of them was called The Casual Birder Pod, and I was like, is that a podcast about bird watching? I was like, nah. And I tweeted at her, I was like, Susie, you need to come on the show, because I had no idea how many episodes she had. I was just literally scratching my own itch, and so I started that conversation, and that's how I got her on. And long story short, we've developed a friendship. She came to LA. We went bird watching together.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's just crazy. Yeah. So again, in terms of like how I engage and I see where people are most responsive, I have a lot, I think people like to do like just blasting out their stuff every day. But if you can kind of just go deep with one or two folks on a platform, I'm of the opinion that you really need to respond to every comment, respond to every tweet, respond to every email. And it's hard. But if you're not willing to do the work to grow that, I mean, it's maybe a nice problem to have, to be you're so busy that you can't. But I don't think anyone on this call is that busy that you can't just say hi or say, thank you for listening. I appreciate you. And I would always ask people on Twitter, I was like, how did you hear about the show? Like, what made you find it? And it's just like, you can go deep on these conversations. And if people are commenting on your show, then you can forward that and you can reshare stuff. So I find I can get a lot more engagement on Twitter. Again, it's just whatever platform's good for you. And, we post all our episodes on Instagram. We don't get a lot of engagement there, but I think in terms of like back and forth engagement, people who are active, the people who are active on Twitter are going to be posting on Twitter. And so when you reply to them, they're the ones that are probably going to be more likely to respond to you, and you can start that conversation. And then people who are watching, they see that conversation as well.
Right. Cool. Thanks, man.
All right, so we got this question from Jane. Let me read this one out. So Jane says, so many tools. You listed a number of ways to post and get the word out. How many different tools are you using per episode, and which ones? She says, I'm using Hootsuite, Canva, Pixels for art, Promo for tiny video clips, and posting to Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, plus her website. So how many tools, Harry, are you using each episode?
Let me think about that now. So we use Edgar for scheduling our posts. And I showed you that we should use Canva to create our artwork and Pixlr to do any tweaks. I'm a big fan of everything being cloud-based. I don't like installs, and we have VAs in the Philippines that help with our stuff as well. So to the extent there's nothing for them to install is really important. the Headliner app for creating the audiograms. I'm also a fan of free tools, so the Headliner app is good for that. And I'm trying to think what else we do from a promo standpoint. We're just testing new stuff out, and I think some of the stuff that I've never really been a fan of any of those Twitter tools that auto like and auto follow, unfollow. They don't seem to have any value. So I think really the scheduling is where it comes in handy. I've tried also what's interesting is for people who are creating show notes and are transcribing it. I interviewed Andrew Mason, the former CEO of Groupon. He's got a new tool called Descript, Descript.com. It automatically transcribes your audio, and it gets it, I think, 80-90% correct. So you can go in and correct it yourself. It comes out to pennies on the minute. So it's a really cheap option.
What tool is that again? What's it
Descript, Descript.com.
Descript.
And if you do, I'll put a link in the comments. If you do fullcast.co/Descript, I think you get the first 100 minutes. You get 100 minutes to use. So
nice.
It was really fascinating. I don't know if many people know about the tool. There's a lot of tools that auto transcribe. Descript, if you pick this option, if you edit the word in the transcription, it'll edit the audio. So if you take out the it's connected to the MP3, and it'll take out that piece of the waveform.
Wow.
In the audio. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So obviously leave it to someone like Andrew Mason to come up with a tool like that, but it's pretty cool. And then they're enhancing it so you can actually record those placeholders. So if you wanted to replace a piece of audio, you would kind of like say the word and then go on and record it if you have to later on. It's really interesting, some of the stuff they're doing, but you can choose to edit the transcription without editing the audio waveform like I do. So this is just tools that make it easier for you, and there's so many ways. People say transcription is important, some people don't, but when it's that cheap, it's something that's worth trying out.
So I'm gonna ask you a question that's maybe a little bit broad and probably could be a whole presentation on its own. But a lot of the stuff that you showed us, it's repeatable stuff that you do episode after episode, and it's the kind of stuff, obviously, that with a little training you could have a VA do.
Yeah.
And as you said, you do use those. What kind of tips do you have for choosing what kind of stuff to give a VA, and then for actually going out and hiring one and making that a positive relationship?
One of the tools we use that's really important for us is Process Street. So I think it's process.st. Process Street is a tool for creating repeatable checklists. What I like about Process Street, and that's also free to start with. What's really interesting about Process Street is I could create a checklist of 20 steps, and then I generate a checklist for each episode. I hit run checklist, and it'll create a new instance of it. If I figure out that something needs to change in one of those steps, I could go back and edit the template, and it'll actually refresh all the open checklists that are using that. So it'll actually go out and repopulate it. So if I realize now we need to add a step for adding to Facebook, I'll edit the master template, and it'll actually repopulate it into any open checklists. So it's really cool because the fact that it does that after the fact and goes back into open checklists that you have is really cool. But my opinion, I'm a huge fan of SOPs, standard operating procedures. And this is really, it's common. It's a common term for entrepreneurs because it's something about building a repeatable process, and everything should be documented. There's a fascinating book called Work the System by Sam Carpenter, which I highly recommend people read. It gets a bit repetitive towards the end, and I think, John, you're nodding your head. I think you've read it as well. It's a great book for just understanding this idea of creating procedures for every single thing you do, and it goes so deep. It's creating for procedures, how to write procedures. That's really fascinating stuff, and the nerd in me really geeks out on stuff like that. I'm OCD, so I love the idea of having stuff documented. And it was really important for me, Jared. In the beginning, when it was just me, when I was creating that mobile app, I had one VA, and I would just write procedures, and a lot of times it was just me writing the procedure for myself, and then I wrote it, and then I would run through it, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try to give this to a VA, and she would do it, and she would get it wrong. Anytime a VA gets anything wrong, this is my opinion, it's my fault. It's not their fault. It just means that I didn't describe the procedure well enough. It wasn't black and white. If there's any gray in the procedure or any room for ambiguity or for them to just kind of try to guess at what the next step is, that you didn't make it clear enough. And so for anyone who's looking to start with a VA and working with one, I would start by pretending you're your own VA and just document your own processes. And literally you may think it's a bit repetitive and mundane, but you're like, click on website, type in this domain, click enter. You really have to be like really, really crystal clear. And you'll find that if you have these processes, and this is something you can lay out on Process Street, if you have these processes and they're clear for people to follow, all you have to do is to test it is basically give it to somebody and say, hey, can you follow this? And can you post this on all my sites to, the way I would want it posted without making any mistakes. And if they stumble along the way, then you got to refine the process, but that's a great start.
We got another question here from Nick. He says, any recommendations for doing a flash briefing for a bi-weekly podcast? I've thought about providing tips and clarification for Dungeons and Dragons rules, but that's not directly related to the show. So, and this is a great question because it's really clear and obvious to see how you do a flash briefing for a news show, because you can provide news updates, or if it's some kind of tip show, because you can provide one tip a day, something like that. For something that's more narrative based, like what Nick is doing, what would you suggest for a flash briefing?
Well, something that I've seen about flash briefings that's important is don't just promote your show, because you'll get subscribers, but then people won't listen. And there's a couple of good Facebook groups where I've been seeing what's working and what's not. And essentially, you should always add value or teach something in each briefing, and you're going to keep it really short. So if you have a Dungeons and Dragons podcast, I mean, I would imagine you could give tips on things Dungeons and Dragons related and have your call to action be, something to drive them to listen to the episode. If you're going to be doing a briefing, the recommendation is to do it every single day, because if they're subscribed to your briefing and there's nothing there, it's going to say the Dungeons and Dragons briefing, no new content. That's actually what the listener is going to hear. So and it's only a minute or too long, I'm of the opinion that I like to have stuff recorded way ahead of time. So I'm actually thinking about recording 30 days in one shot. I'm just in the process of getting mine set up, and that way I don't have to worry about it. And if I could, I'd record out 90 days. And I've heard stories of people locking themselves up and knocking out a good 90 days worth of content. It takes them a couple of hours, but then they're good, right? And so as long as you're teaching folks something or they're learning something new from your briefings, I think that you're going to continue to add value. If you're just using it to market your show, I think people will not continue to subscribe to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, if there are any other questions, post them here. Harry, once again, this was fantastic. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.
Coming on. Now there's so much stuff to think about and try to add to the process. As you were going through this, I was thinking about all these different things that I'm not doing that I can start doing. So it's really this is really, really good stuff.
Well, I appreciate everyone who's on live. Jane, Heather, I know Eric was on earlier, Nick. So it's really good, and I think we'll get some more feedback once it's posted into the group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Johnny, any final thoughts before we sign off?
I'm looking at the landing page for Descript right now. My mind's kind of blown.
I know. Now that there's all these tools, I'm ready to hop off and start seeing what I want to do.
Watching it is like, wow, it's cool.
Yeah, this editing of the waveform is pretty wild. I don't even know, and they keep improving it. So, and the best part about it is if you send a support ticket to Andrew at Descript, he responds. He's the guy.
Awesome.
I don't know if he's still doing it, but he's good. So.
Good final thought here from Eric in the chat. He says, Harry is a great teacher, and I'm glad to know him. So I would agree with that. We're glad to know you, Harry, and thank you for coming on and sharing your presentation with us. We really appreciate it.
And I appreciate what you guys are doing for the community and giving me this platform. I'm always grateful to what you guys are doing, and anything you guys are doing, I always want to support it 100%.
Sounds great, man. We appreciate it.
All right.
All right, everybody. We will. I'll get the replay posted. If you have additional thoughts or comments on this, go into the actual event page. That will stay live. You'll see it in the past events. You can comment there because we'll all see those comments. And then I'm also going to post this recording. Mighty Networks has a course feature, so I'm going to get it posted in there, and we'll kind of have all these events that we do posted as a course. So we'll get that up as well. So that's where.
And I'll let you know when that link is live as well, Jared.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just post a comment on that event.
Yeah. Okay.
Sweet. All right, everybody. We will see you inside the community.
Take care.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Jared.
Yep. Thanks, Harry.
Okay.